So, welcome everyone. It is great to see many familiar faces and some unfamiliar ones this morning for this Progressive Democrats of Massachusetts's fifth and, for the moment, final forum on the affordable housing crisis. I'm Peter Enrich. I'm the chair of Progressive Dems, and I will be moderating today's discussion. And let me start just by a very quick overview of what we're intending to do today, and then introduce our three extraordinary panelists, and then we'll be off and running. So Progressive Dems decided over a year ago that we really needed to focus on the affordable housing crisis that is such a huge challenge for the state. And as we started to look at it, we realized just how many layers and how much complexity there is in this issue. So we decided that we were going to start off our engagement by doing a series of our monthly forums focused on the housing issue. And this is the fifth forum in that series. And let me just remind those of you who have been here and those who have not of how we've structured the forums so far. The first forum was an overview at which we attempted to get a general sense of what the issue is and how it's impacting people's lives. And we identified at the center of the problem the undersupply of housing. People tend to say 200,000 or so units shy of what we would need to house our population, and the impacts on people's lives in all sorts of severe and dramatic ways. The next three forums we then used to try and dig into what we saw as three key dimensions of the problem. The first one, we focused on the short-term issue. While we still have a dramatic shortfall of supply, what do we do to keep people housed and make their conditions livable while we're dealing with the shortfall? The next two were really addressed at, so what will it take to build the housing supply and opportunities that we need? The first of those two focused on regulatory challenges, particularly zoning obstacles, but also other ways that our regulatory systems, primarily at the local level, can obstruct or can facilitate building the kind of housing we need at the kind of pace we need it built. And then the second of those two, about how we get the supply corrected, was focused on the costs. How can you get housing built? How can you get housing built in a way that's affordable to people? Or how can you provide people with the finances they need to pay for what it costs to build the housing? So we now, having surveyed those three dimensions, we're now turning back to our original goal, which is, so what does state and local policy have to do with this? And for Progressive Dems, more important, what can grassroots activists like PDM's members around the state be doing to help move the ball here? So that's the focus of today's conversation. It's preparing us, Progressive Dems, for a meeting of our sustaining members, which is scheduled for next week, at which we're going to really go through a range of issues that we could be pitching in on and try to set some priorities for us and our members. For those of you who aren't yet sustaining members, please consider going to our website and becoming a sustaining member. We'll then invite you to that conversation, and we'll be happy to have you be part of that and part of our action planning going ahead. So at this point, let me introduce the three people who have agreed to be on our panel today. And as I said, I am just so thrilled. I think we're incredibly lucky to have each of these three people who are just deeply knowledgeable and deeply engaged in these issues. So first is Secretary Ed Augustus, who is the cabinet secretary of the new Executive Office for Housing and Livable Communities. One of the Healey administration's steps on addressing this problem is to create this new secretariat and to bring in Secretary Augustus to lead it. Ed has a long and distinguished career to date. He was the city manager in Worcester for a number of years. He was a state senator representing Worcester for a number of years. He's been chief of staff to Congressman Jim McGovern. He's been a leader on a whole range of issues for many years, and I think we're really fortunate that he is taken on this role in the Healey administration, and we're particularly lucky that he's here with us today. Second, Carolyn Chou. Carolyn is the director of Homes for All Mass, which is a statewide coalition that has taken on a real leadership role on issues of housing justice. They have taken on, they are leaders on issues of rent stabilization, of eviction management, and some of the key issues that are most impactful for lower income residents. Carolyn, at the same time that she's heading Homes for All, is also the executive director of the Asian American Resource Workshop, which is a Dorchester-based group that has provided real strength for the Vietnamese American community in Dorchester, and has done a lot of neighborhood work there on jobs, housing, and other equity issues. And Carolyn is fast rising as a real leader in the progressive activist community in Boston and around the state. And last, but by no means least, our good friend Josh Zakim, who we have been closely connected with for years, including supporting him when he ran for Secretary of State several years ago. Josh is an attorney, trained at my law school at Northeastern, worked for a number of years at Greater Boston Legal Services, then went on to election and service on the Boston City Council for 3 terms. Ran for Secretary of State and has now taken on the leadership of, sorry, I forgot the name of his organization, and it's not in my list, of the Housing Forward Mass. I'm sorry, Josh, which has been doing a lot of excellent policy work in the area. So I want to open this up by asking each of the 3 panelists 2 questions. We'll do 2 rounds. The first question is, so what are the key things that state and local governments need to be doing to address the housing crisis? And then the second, I want to focus a little more narrowly on advocacy groups like Progressive Dems and ask, what is it right now that progressive grassroots activists ought to be doing to move the ball? But let's start, and Secretary Augustus, I'd love to have you start on this. What are the key challenges that we need to be addressing now as a state and as municipalities?
Yeah, well, first, thank you, Peter, for inviting me, and good to see everyone this morning. And if I might just give a big shout out to Corinne, who my understanding testified at 10 p.m. At the Housing Committee's hearing on the Affordable Homes Act, which was 11 hours after it started. So that is hardcore, very impressive, and very much appreciated. So thank you for that. To answer the question, a lot of what we included in the Affordable Homes Act, we think are some of the tools necessary to deal with the challenges that we're facing, and they are supply demand. There just isn't enough supply of affordable homes, rental opportunities, and ownership opportunities in the Commonwealth to meet the need. And that's provable by a whole bunch of indicators, whether it be the vacancy rate in the state, just the number of available units at any given time. It's less than 2%, which is one of the lowest in the country. Or you see the families that we have in the emergency assistance shelter system, 7,500 families, about 25,000 people. That's not counting individual homeless folks or folks who are housing insecure, folks who are doubled up or otherwise in a precarious housing situation. So there just is not enough supply. And so why is there not enough supply? Part of the reason we think is some of the historic barriers that local communities have erected to housing production, particularly more dense family units. Seniors tend to be less worrisome to communities. So sometimes you can get affordable housing that's age restricted because, you know, some folks in communities don't think that seniors are going to be a drain on local government services like schools and other things. So families have historically been a lot harder to construct units of housing. Now, that's not true. The idea that if you erect family housing in a community that it's going to result in huge spikes of students. We're going through a demographic change in Massachusetts where we've actually seen the student population shrink in the last number of years, and that's projected to continue. So in a lot of cases, communities could actually save some of their Chapter 70 funding if they had more kids coming into the community. Otherwise, the formula is very much got a factor about student enrollment embedded in it. And, you know, if enrollment goes down, you're going to lose funding for your schools in a lot of these communities. So that means less teachers, less programs, et cetera. So I think we need to continue to implement the MBTA Communities Act, which is one of the responsibilities of this new secretariat. We've got 11 of the 12 transit communities, so they broke the communities down into categories based on how many mass transit stops that they had in their community, the amount of service that a community had. We're reviewing those right now, but you can see in the town of Milton, which actually did what they were required to do. They passed it overwhelmingly in their town meeting, but there was such a backlash that folks in the community collected signatures, and now there'll be a referendum as to whether or not to repeal what town meeting approved, which was necessary with the MBTA Communities Act. So we're going back and forth, fighting over whether communities should take down some of these barriers, some of these historic limitations that they've put up. And I think we need to continue to do that. And so we'll do that on the MBTA implementation, but embedded in the bill is things like ADUs as of right. So the ability for folks to create accessory dwelling units and not do some of the kind of tricks that communities sometimes play, which requires that ADUs only be for a family member. Well, it's virtually impossible to get the financing from a bank to create that ADU if it's so limited, because what do you do when the family member passes away? You'll have no income coming in on that unit. How do you pay off so you virtually won't be able to access capital to do the construction on those units. So we want to create ADUs as of right. Other states have done this. California's done this recently, created tens of thousands of units. We estimate that 8,000 to 10,000 units would be created in the first 5 years if we removed those barriers. So getting rid of some of the local barriers, that's kind of category one, and then improving some of the funding, not only to create new units, but to preserve what we've got. And I would tell you that we have a very serious threat to losing some of our 43,000 public housing units here in Massachusetts if we don't catch up on a historic disinvestment in that portfolio. We've got hundreds and hundreds of units that are offline. They're built, but they're not habitable because of capital improvements that are necessary to bring those units back online. And so we're recommending in this legislation tripling the amount of capital funding to those public housing units in order to, number one, decarbonize them. We've got a whole set-aside program. We know housing is the biggest contributor to carbon emissions. We ought to lead by example by decarbonizing our state-owned public housing assets. This bill tries to accomplish that while also making some necessary repairs so that our public housing units are healthy, safe, and dignified, which is a pretty basic kind of expectation for public housing, while we also supercharge like our Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which we double in this bill, and some of the other tools that we use for production. So there's so much more in the things that we're working on, but if you ask me to put it into two buckets, I would put it remove local barriers to housing production, and then supercharge the tools, low-income housing tax credits, affordable housing trust fund, the subsidized housing trust, are other kind of tools that help spur production of affordable housing units in the state.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate how tightly you were able to package that. I know there's just a huge amount to cover here. I neglected to say two things that I should have said at the outset. The first is the PDM group that's working on these issues has put together a sort of an initial tentative list of what we see as some of the priorities that we may want to be focusing on. We had thought of putting it up as a screen share, but it's still way too long and wordy to be useful in that form. But Jean has put the link to that up in the chat. And so you may want to take a look at that as we're going along. Many of the things that the secretary just referenced are on that list. We're sort of keeping an eye on what things people have to suggest. The other thing that I meant to say, and we usually say at the outset, is we discourage people from using the chat function to engage in debate around these issues. We find that's distracting, and we'd rather have everyone's attention on the conversation that's going on. But we do invite, if you have questions that you feel are important to answer, particularly questions that are important to answer as we move forward in deciding on our Progressive Dems priorities, please do put those in the chat. Don't know that we'll get to all of them today, but we will attempt to follow up on ones that we don't get to today. So we do encourage that. So with that said, Carolyn, let me pass the ball on to you and ask you what you're seeing as the key challenges at this point.
Great. Thanks so much, Peter. And thank you all for having me. As Peter said, my name is Carolyn Chou. I'm the new director at Homes for All Massachusetts. We are a coalition of housing justice and tenant organizing groups across the state, anchored by Springfield No One Leaves, Lynn United for Change, City Life Vida Urbana, and New England United for Justice with a broader coalition. And, I think that a lot of what Secretary Augustus mentioned, resonates with us, and we mostly have some additions we are suggesting as we think about long-term production, right? We know from our work that every day families are getting displaced out of their communities, are getting their rents doubled, right? Are having to move around the state, or having to leave the Commonwealth. And so, we are really concerned with how we both do some of what the Affordable Homes Act does. Like, particularly, we want to highlight preserve and build affordable housing, and with the preservation, both public housing, as mentioned, and naturally occurring affordable housing. So, we see things like TOPA and land trusts and other mechanisms as also key to preserving naturally occurring affordable housing alongside preserving public housing, and exploring building new public housing alongside other sorts of new affordable housing. And obviously,
can you just very quickly remind people what TOPA is for those who are not
yes.
the experts here?
Thank you. My attempt to go quickly, I think, is leading me. So TOPA being Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. So the ability for tenants to have the first right of refusal as when their building is being sold. So right now, an example of a building that could use that is there's a large development in Ayer, Massachusetts, called Devon's Crest, and they formed a tenant association with support of city like Vita Urbana. And if there was, and now they're the landlord developer is trying to sell. If TOPA was possible, they could work with an affordable housing developer or some other mechanism to actually have the first right of refusal and purchase that building or complex, I should say. And so, you know, I think all of that's really important, but I was like, let me breeze through some of these really key pieces, including, I'd be remiss to say, you know, the transfer fee, I know everyone on this call has worked on, I imagine, but the transfer fee has been so key, and we're so glad it's in the Affordable Homes Act, and we still want to make sure it works for communities across the state. You know, we know the current form works for Boston and Nantucket, but there's a need to build more affordable housing across the Commonwealth, as well as, you know, increase production overall. And so, you know, I think the tweaks that the coalition and you all are probably know even more than me about are really key to that. But again, any infusion of money that's really and support to preserve and build affordable housing is gonna help keep the folks we see every day here in our Commonwealth. But we also know that whether it's market rate or affordable housing, housing production takes a lot of time. And we have an urgent crisis. And so we have really been advocating for rent control and foreclosure mediation now to keep tenants and low income homeowners in their homes now, right? As ways we can be stabilizing folks while we look to build the kind of housing we need across the state. And so we are, so some ways we're doing that is proposing that rent control and foreclosure mediation be added to the bond bill. We also have standalone bills that could move through committee. And you know, there's been a move on home rule petitions around rent control that we're very excited about. Obviously, Boston, Somerville, and Brookline. And, you know, if in your municipality that would be something you think is worth bringing up, I think it's very important, because any rent control policy we win is going to be local option. And so the more work we can do in our cities and towns to make sure that it's a top issue is a way that we can be both pushing a home rule and setting ourselves up to, when we get a local option rent control, to have cities and towns ready to enact it. And, you know, there's other tenant protections that are key. I would just be remiss while Secretary is on to not mention, we're so glad access to counsel got in the budget and other tenant protections. But, you know, as an example, access to counsel is so key, and it's not illegal for your landlord to double your rent. So, you know, in my own neighborhood work, right, we've seen, we worked with Greater Boston Legal Service Asian Outreach Center and the Vietnamese speaking attorneys, and we're able to get a resident we were working with an attorney, and it bought her a year in her unit, but her landlord will still double her rent in that year, and she will be faced with trying to find a new unit, which we know is very hard for all the reasons we're discussing around affordable housing preservation and production. And we also know, because of the shelter crisis, that it's also, you know, it's very hard to get into shelter as a crisis mechanism now too. And so it's a really, you know, serious situation. We both see long-term and short-term. And I'll just end by saying, so that is why, you know, we think rent control is a key way that we can protect folks now while we do these other tenant protections. And again, we work to producing more affordable housing and housing in general. So I'll end there.
Thanks so much, Carolyn. That's really a helpful additional perspective. So Josh, what else, or what of the same things would you put on the plate?
Sure. Well, I would say I agree with everything that Secretary Augustus said, and I appreciate, that Governor Healy, Lieutenant Governor Driscoll, the whole administration have really been leaders on this issue, have focused aggressively on production, on enforcing the MBTA Communities Act. And I'd be remiss if I didn't also applaud my former city council colleague, Attorney General Campbell, on her aggressive, not yet enforcement, it's not necessary, but threats of enforcement of that bill on communities that are continuing to resist, because so much of our housing shortage and the ills that Carolyn was talking about, that we all know so much about, displacement, high costs, are due to cities and towns across the Commonwealth refusing to build housing for families, for lower income people, for the other people, or those people, as often comes up in these conversations. I think, and I believe I've said this before, perhaps even to this group, Peter, is that it's no coincidence that so much of this restrictive zoning came about in Massachusetts around the time the U.S. Supreme Court forbade racially restrictive covenants in housing. Much of our zoning came about out of an explicit desire to exclude, whether it was immigrants, poor people, people of color, from communities. And the effect of restrictive zoning is continuing to have that effect even today. And it's also not allowing the needed production of housing. And to the other part of your question, what can local activists do right now? I will say supporting the state efforts, I think particularly around MBTA communities. I would also continue to encourage, and the secretary, as a former member of the legislature, is well aware of this, to keep the focus on housing and on zoning reform. That while MBTA communities was a huge step forward, it's not enough. And as Carolyn said, this all takes time anyway. We have to keep our pedal to the metal. We need to make sure this is front and center for everyone, and showing up locally. Because no matter how much the governor is doing, even if the federal government somehow comes in with more money for affordable housing, which I'm always hopeful for, these decisions are made on the local level every day in 351 cities and towns, which is where you all and your membership, I think, can have the biggest impact. Oftentimes, whether it's a community meeting, whether it's town meeting, whether it's a zoning or a planning board, showing up and being a thoughtful advocate for new housing. And that's what we really need to do, to be available to say to some folks, and we have some of this material on the Housing Forward Massachusetts website, the counters to some of the arguments. Oh, the schools will be overwhelmed, or our sewer system can't take it, or the police. I mean, number one, there are state resources to plug those gaps, if they do exist, that are allocated. But number two, that's often just not the case. What you'll see is improvements. What you'll see is stronger communities, more diverse communities. So I would just say, if there's one thing that every individual can do on housing, and Corinne being there for 12 hours at the hearing is outstanding. Not everyone can do that. But what I do think, especially in the age where so many of these meetings are done virtually, logging on to a planning board or a zoning commission hearing in your city or town to say yes to housing is incredibly powerful, because more often than not, the only voices that are there are a developer, a builder, whether it's a for-profit or a nonprofit, and the opposition. And for elected and appointed officials to hear that there are residents, voters, who feel differently, who think we do want to solve our housing crisis in the Commonwealth by building new housing, that is incredibly powerful. And again, I don't want to keep plugging our website, but we do have tools there on organizing, on who makes these decisions. And, we want to be helpful on that, because I think the state, both the legislature and the administration, are moving in the right direction. There are activists like you all who are taking up the mantle on this. But it's the everyday, it's the local, municipal, town hall stuff that really is where the rubber meets the road, and where these decisions are made if we're going to have enough housing for people to stay and thrive in our Commonwealth.
Thanks, Josh. And I don't know how you are at multitasking, but if you're capable of putting the link to your website in the chat, that would be
Sure.
welcome. We will also post it in the materials that we put up on our website afterwards, but it'd be great to have it. So I'm going to improvise a little bit, and I'm going to hold off on the question from Carolyn and from Secretary Augustus about what activists like us should be doing toward the end, because I want to focus us in on just a few of the pieces that they have raised. And Lord knows we could spend several hours going through a bunch of these, and we'll, our housing working group will keep pursuing details. But let me just pick up a couple of ones that I'd like to hear a little more about. The first is rent control, which Carolyn did focus on, and which is notably absent from any of the pending administration's legislation. And so, and I guess I have a couple of questions. First, Secretary Augustus, what is the administration's view about the place that rent control has in the larger story?
I'm going to try to answer that, Peter, without getting fired. We'll see how I do. The governor's position has been that she'll look at any piece of legislation that gets to her desk. So to the point I think Carolyn was making, there are a number of home rule petitions that have been filed by communities asking for the ability to enact rent control in those communities. So I think the legislature, the housing committee did do a hearing, whether those home rules come out of that committee and with recommendations to the House and Senate, we'll have to see. I would say I think we specifically chose not to include rent control as part of our bill because we thought politically it probably was a distraction from some of the things that we could get done. There's very strong feelings about this on both sides of the equation, as you all know. And we took, the practical judgment that what can we do to push the envelope to really try to move the needle on the housing crisis, but actually get it done. Now, some people may disagree whether we could have gotten rent control done or not, but I think we decided that that was so polarizing an issue for the legislature and the public at large that we would focus on the things we thought we could get done. So that's what I could
Thanks.
share.
Okay. And Carolyn, I guess the question I want to ask for you is for the groups that are really working this issue, what are you seeing as the path forward? What role should activists who think that restoring the right of municipalities to make their own choices on this, what should people be doing when? What's the timeline? What's the strategy?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And thank you, Secretary Augustus. That was good to hear it. And, I hope there's more work we can all do on this issue together. As mentioned, the housing hearing already happened that had both rent control bills, local option bills, and then the home rules. Well, it was only Boston, Brooklyn, and Somerville are just filing. But, we have an opportunity right now to say the bond bill is a historic investment. There's so much housing policy happening. It's a number one priority in the Commonwealth, and the legislature can move these rent control bills, whether through the bond bill or, as legislation, right? So, we know how the legislative cycle works. There is a push we're hoping to make in the next few weeks to get our bills out of committee and to continue to add it to the discourse around the bond bill, as that's the discourse around housing right now across the Commonwealth. So, I'll put some bill information, but and we're hoping to have convene folks soon. But we would encourage folks to encourage the housing committee to, move the rent control legislation forward. And we also, as Secretary Augustus said, know that this is a real challenge in the legislature. We know on the ground, rent control resonates. I mean, rent control resonates in a lot of places you wouldn't expect right now here in Massachusetts. And we're in a moment where there's a groundswell of support. That does not mean that at the legislature, there is the same dynamic because of people's positions and their own experiences. And so that's a bigger challenge we face as progressives working with the legislature, but it also means we know we have to push in many ways. So I would say most short term, let's try to push this session through the bond bill and through, the housing committee. Let's try to get these bills out. And also, if that does not happen, we will refile. We will want to move more home rules, and we will be prepared to, take this to the ballot at some point if needed because of that groundswell. So I would say if anyone's interested in talking about a home rule petition strategy in their city or town, happy to talk more about that. I'll put the bill information and hoping to get folks to do some work on this cycle session. And then, we have if we can't advance the whole thing forward, we have next session and the potential future ballot question.
Peter, I think you're muted still.
Thank you. Let me just add two points on this issue, and then widen the spectrum a little bit. At least for me, there's something odd about the fact that the legislature and policymakers generally are having a hard time limiting local power in most land use planning decisions. And yet in this one, they're having a hard time giving more power to local municipalities to make decisions about how they want to do their housing policy. There's something troublingly inconsistent about that. And I don't know how we make that case. The other thing I want to say is you often, what one hears from time to time from proponents of rent control is it's the only thing that is going to provide short-term immediate relief to many tenants. And I guess what I want to explore a little bit is are there other key things that will, while we're struggling over rent control, provide immediate relief? And Josh, let me toss that one to you.
Sure.
Are there other things that belong on the immediate short-term table?
Yeah. Well, and I think one, as far as rent control goes, you said, the short-term relief. And I think that's important in those conversations, is it's not, and the governor's, I think, been pretty vocal on saying this. I think Mayor Wu has said it as well, and others, is that it's not the solution to our housing crisis. And I think if we're in conversations, whether it's through a home rule or state legislation or even ultimately a ballot question, it's really important that we view it, if there's a policy that makes sense, as limited and as a bridge to increasing supply, and perhaps coupling any proposal for rent control with aggressive pro-housing legislation that mandates upzoning, more construction. I would look to Oregon as an example, where they are the first statewide rent control, probably almost 10 years ago now, that also aggressively increased housing production in connection with that, because otherwise I think we're going down a challenging path when we have a lack of supply. But other immediate aspects are rental assistance, are things like housing stability offices in municipalities, mediation. I think there are very few landlords, small, large, medium, that want to be evicting tenants. I don't think that's usually the case. There are obviously exceptions and people, and I issued some subpoenas in my day on the city council to call some of those to account. But in general, I think folks want to work together and collaboratively. If we set up systems for folks to do that together, collaboratively with the state, with municipalities, and connecting folks with resources, I think, more often than not, a lot of people, and access to counsel is an important component of this, did not know what their rights were, did not know what their options were when they were having challenges with their landlords. As you mentioned, after I excelled in your contracts class at Northeastern University School of Law, I did spend some time at Greater Boston Legal Services working in the foreclosure prevention unit at the height of the financial crisis, when we were working on mortgage modifications, people being kicked out of their homes. And almost every time once they had access to counsel, even sometimes law student counsel, it changed the whole landscape. And it actually ended up usually being more financially beneficial to, in those cases, the banks, as well as the homeowners or tenants, to go through a thoughtful negotiation. So having that mediation is important, having the rental assistance, which the governor has been active on, and also working with our federal delegation to increase the low-income housing tax credit and other forms of federal assistance, because as much as the Commonwealth is doing, as outstanding as the bond bill is and what cities and towns are doing, the federal government is the only entity that has the checkbook to really spur and finance a lot of that affordable housing that we need in the Commonwealth and really across the country.
So in the context of what are the short-term things that can be done, I want to pick up on a question that Jackie has put in the chat. What's the place for expansion of the state's voucher program? And I know that the governor's budget that was filed a couple of days ago does make some increases. I don't know the details. I don't know what the opportunities there are. So, Secretary Augustus, can you say a couple of words about that?
Sure. The governor's budget, as you mentioned, that was shared with the legislature on Wednesday, increases by 22% the MRVP voucher program. So a significant increase in that program. We also have a home-based program, which is often used to help families stay. Sometimes we can use that for utilities and other things that challenge somebody with staying in their home. So we've significantly increased the funding, I think over 50% in that category. So trying to work upstream, if you will, and prevent folks from being evicted or foreclosed on by providing some of those additional resources. We also have, and I think that was part of the question too about the project-based vouchers. We use those very frequently, including the ARVP vouchers to create units. Sometimes that's a necessary subsidy that we issue a voucher that creates an accessible unit in the case of the ARVP, which are much needed in a short supply, that allows that unit to actually come online so that we can get a family or individuals in there who need those units. So using them, actually, we're now trying to use them as a strategy to exit some of the families that we have in emergency shelter. We've put 1,200 vouchers available to those families to try to move them out because we've got a cap on the system. We've got people on the wait list. The only way to get people off that wait list and into the system is to create exits out of the other end. The vouchers are a strategy to try to do that, as is home-based. The challenge is when you've got such limited supply, less than 2% vacancy, there's not a lot of slack in the system to be able to even use those vouchers, which is why we're so focused on supply and increasing that supply, because you can have all the vouchers in the world, but if there aren't units to use them. One other quick little thing I would say, we've also done something, through the administration's efforts to switch over to allow for small area median rents for our state vouchers. Previously, the vouchers were valued based on regions. The state was divvied up into 19 regions. So it really kind of forced the voucher usage within those regions into the lower income communities or neighborhoods within those regions, because that's where the value, could be used. By going to small area value for the vouchers, we're now doing 620 zip codes in Massachusetts. So that means the voucher's value calibrates to that particular zip code area, which we think is going to open up more neighborhoods and more communities for the ability to use our vouchers, because the value of them will calibrate more specifically to those areas. So that's kind of a small kind of arcane step, but one we think is right in terms of opening up more opportunities and not forcing people just into particular neighborhoods or communities with the vouchers.
Great. Another area that I wanted to, thinking ahead to where Progressive Dems may want to pitch in. And again, with a focus on what is going to make a relatively quick difference on these issues. There's a huge number of different capital authorizations that are proposed in the bond bill. And I'm wondering which are the ones that are, we've sort of tentatively identified three as the most significant ones, but I don't know if we're getting this right. I mean, the three that we sort of looked at were the Affordable Housing Trust, the Housing Stabilization and Investment Trust, and the Public Housing Repair and Modernization pieces. Are those the right ones to be focusing on? And any of you who want to pitch in on that, please do.
There are three critical ones, three of the bigger ones. I would also say that our innovation fund, the bucket of innovation, we think that's important for a whole bunch of reasons. We've been doing in some parts of the state kind of repositioning of public housing units. You might have seen this. There's one in Chelsea that's going on right now. There's a number in Boston that are proposed, a couple in Worcester that are proposed, where you literally take some of the units that are just too old and dilapidated and you tear them down. You build back not only that number of units that you lost, but additional units. So you add to the portfolio and you introduce some market rate units that creates mixed income neighborhoods instead of, the all kind of income restricted neighborhoods, which tend to be healthier neighborhoods when you've got the mixed income neighborhoods. And it helps subsidize the cost of the additional new units by bringing in those market rate units in the mix. And so that innovation fund is one of the buckets that we use to help with those particular projects. Another thing that we are pushing, and we've been trying to support Mayor Wu, who's made this a priority, is the conversion of office buildings to housing. We know the office market has kind of fallen apart in this post-pandemic world. So we've got a lot of buildings that are vacant, underperforming, that are not going to be turned back into office space, but could be used for housing. Sometimes, I know I did this in Worcester when I was city manager, there were a lot of historic buildings that we didn't want to lose the historic character of the community. There were intact blocks, which anybody who kind of cares about urban design knows you don't want to have holes in intact blocks by losing buildings. So it was allowing us to put density in the places where we wanted it to support retail on the first floor levels. It's greener because you're keeping a lot of the elements of the existing building, and it saves historic buildings, et cetera. So that innovation fund allows us to kind of support some of those projects as well. The last one I would highlight is the supportive housing. We think this is really critical, especially for our former homeless individuals who, we know working with homeless populations, it's one thing to find a unit, but in order to keep folks rehoused, a lot of times you need those supportive services to help deal with some of the challenges that they might be facing. We also use this a lot with our senior community. A lot of times seniors need some additional supports in order to stay independent, stay in their units. And we've been supporting some of those in this subsidized supportive housing bucket. Really, I think is going to help meet a need for some of our more vulnerable populations as well.
Great, thanks. Josh, Carolyn, anything to add on this one?
Just to say, I think as Secretary Augustus said, I mean, the funding is so key. I think, as you said, Peter, the Affordable Housing Trust is key. Some small things that I think are more on their policy, but funding that I wanted to lift up are the Greater Boston Land Trust Network is proposing adding a small property state acquisition fund, which is a pilot that is being run now in the state, but infusing funds into that in the bond bill, which would allow for permanently affordable, to basically take housing off the speculative market and made it get permanently affordable. I think, I was glad to see, we were glad to see, the social housing conversation move forward through this and some initial pilot funding. I think there's lots of conversations on how we define social housing and what we're looking to, what our vision is. But I think, to even have that in there is huge. So, I would suggest that folks continue to advocate for these more innovative models, both that are in the bond bill, like the social housing, and that could be like the small property state acquisition fund. And just one slightly unrelated point, but just because it was in the chat, I do think, related to the small property acquisition fund, actually, I think that this conversation around speculation and the MAPC report that the report that came out that I believe is linked in the chat, it's a big conversation in terms of both policy and production and all of this, that we're losing units that were in a neighborhood like mine in Boston. We're losing units that were rental units all the time, because every time someone ages out of their home, they're not being bought by someone who's gonna, have the 3-decker and have 2 rental units. They're being bought by an investor who will flip them into condos and sell them for close to $1 million in my Dorchester neighborhood. And so I think we have to think about how that all relates. And I know in seasonal communities, you all are really seeing that on the Airbnb side, but just wanted to throw that in as another piece that I think connects to both the tenant protection piece and some of just the conversation around the housing stock we have in the state.
And if I could just add on, I agree with what Carolyn was saying, especially about community land trusts and purchasing. We talk about this naturally occurring affordable housing. As we have a housing shortage, it's no longer going to be naturally occurring affordable housing, because whether it's tenant turnover, whether it's investors, whomever is coming in, or quite frankly, it's just folks with higher incomes who can't quite afford, the next level building, but they're going to come in, and where someone was paying $1,500 a month, they're going to pay $2,000 or $2,500 a month. What I think is critical is whether it's the state in conjunction with nonprofits and municipalities, is purchasing, in some cases, affordability restrictions from the current owner at, some reasonable negotiated price. I know the city of Boston has done that quite a bit. I believe, I know the secretary is on here, but I believe Worcester is doing a similar program, particularly around renovations, and requiring an affordability covenant after that runs with the land. I think that's an important short-term solution, especially as we all know, with the cost of producing new housing, whether it's affordable or market rate, is certainly in Greater Boston is around $650,000 a unit. Across the state, it's not much lower. So thinking about, can we, for $50,000 or even it's $100,000 of public investment, purchase a long-term, a 50-year, 99-year deed restriction on a property to be rented at? Again, it's going to vary by community. What's an appropriate level of affordability? If it's a triple decker, you've just created 3 affordable units for $100,000, for $50,000 or $100,000. It would have cost you $1.5 million to $2 million to build it. Even if we're talking affordable, I'm not even talking about market rate housing. And I think that's something that we need to make sure we're thinking about and being efficient, because again, no matter how focused the Commonwealth is on this, we do not have an unlimited budget. Being efficient on doing this while also incentivizing the creation of more housing for the market and for affordability, I think is really important.
Boy, this is such a rich conversation, and I wish that it could go on for hours more, and we may need to do some more forums on some of these more complex and more innovative ideas. But our time is almost up, and I do want to close by giving each of you just a minute to talk about what should activists in groups like PDM be seeing as our focus over the coming months. And before I do that, let me just remind everyone, we as PDM are going to be meeting on Sunday, February 4th. If you are a sustaining member, you'll get an invitation. If you're not yet a sustaining member, go to our website and sign up so that we will include you. And we're going to have the robust discussion about how to move forward, what our focus should be, how we operationalize that. But let me first turn it to each of our wonderful panelists and ask you each just to take a minute to say, where should we be focusing our energies? And Carolyn, you want to kick it off?
Sure. And sorry, I keep turning my video off. My Wi-Fi was lagging, but I think I'm back. Yeah, I think, in a minute, to be on message, I will say we believe we need to stabilize tenants right now while we do this long-term visionary work to house people in the Commonwealth. And so that means rent control and foreclosure mediation. And we can do it when we all come together. There's all this, it's been a hot button issue, something you can't talk about, but we're in a new era because of the crisis that we're facing in Massachusetts, and we're ready to win rent control for our cities and towns and make sure that low-income homeowners can still stay in their homes, because as Josh mentioned, the foreclosure crisis has not ever ended, particularly for folks in Worcester and Springfield. And so, yeah, those are for us the immediate steps, though we understand them as not the single answer, but as part of a broader agenda to make sure that the working class people who make our state what it is can stay here and thrive.
Great. Josh.
I'm just going to repeat myself, is show up to local planning and zoning meetings. It is by far the biggest bang for your buck you're going to get on creating more housing across the Commonwealth. I'm talking about whether it's a triple decker or whether it's a 150 unit proposal on vacant land. We need more voices of community members to do it. It's effective. And I'll say, when you can do it on Zoom, it's not even that burdensome to show up. You don't have to go to town hall or the public library and sit there for 3 hours waiting to speak. You can be cooking dinner. You can be reading a book. You can play video games if that's your thing until it's your turn to speak. But really, that is the power. I mean, I often lament local control over zoning and planning because it's gotten us this position. But that is where the power is right now in Massachusetts when it comes to land use and housing. So please show up to those meetings to the extent you can. Tell your neighbors, encourage them also to support housing, not to show up to oppose it. I think that's the best thing you could do right now. And of course, in conjunction with everything else you're doing at the state level and your advocacy. But that is something an individual can do and make a real difference.
Great, thank you. Secretary Augustus.
Well, it's perfect segue. So everything Josh just said, the world is run by those who show up. And when it comes to like a zoning board, or many of you might live in communities that have open town meetings. So you just show up on the night of the town meeting. If there's an MBTA proposal, or maybe there's another housing proposal, believe me, all the people who are against it, they're going to show up. And as Josh mentioned, the developer may show up, maybe somebody from the planning board, if you've got a fairly progressive planning board, but everybody who's against it, who thinks that you don't have enough parking, that, those people are going to be crowding the neighborhood, all of the stuff that we hear all the time, they're showing up. So the question is, are we going to show up? And to the extent anybody in Milton, the most immediate pressing thing, they're going to have an override. Call them, get them out there, fight back, let them kind of stick with the plan that they submitted, which we think was probably a very good step in the right direction. I guess lastly, and I wanted to play off one thing Josh mentioned, on the whole naturally occurring affordable housing. That's one of the reasons that we added the transfer fee to the bill. It is by far the most controversial part of the bill. It's going to be the piece that gets the most kind of pushback and, attention. Now, I know there are folks on the western part of the state who think that, the way it's structured now, it doesn't benefit them enough. And there's probably some truth to that. We wanted to try to make it progressive so it didn't hit first-time home buyers and others, and put the kick-in amount at $1 million in order to protect those folks. But I think there can be some tweaks made by the legislature that, you know, allow it to still be progressive in the eastern part of the state, but also relevant in the western part of the state where you don't have a lot of land transferring at that level annually, so they could get the benefits of it. But what it would do is it would put dollars in the hands of cities and towns who are closer to knowing when that 12-unit apartment building is getting ready to be sold, and would have dollars available to them exclusively for the production and preservation of affordable housing, and could jump in there, maybe in conjunction with a CDC or somebody else, purchase the property or get an affordability restriction on that property and preserve it. It'll be way more nimble than the state will be if the community has to put in an application and go through a process with us, and thus funding a program and getting it out. The market moves quicker than that, and we need to be nimble, and we need to have the resources. So that was really our thoughtful strategy around the transfer fee, and it's the most in jeopardy in the bill. So, you know, weigh in specifically on that when you're talking to legislators, because if anything ends up on the cutting room floor, I'm worried it's that.
Right, that's really helpful. So I'm afraid I need to close, and I want to close by just thanking the three of you for being part of this and for all of the incredible leadership that all three of you have been showing on these issues, along with a few other people who are on the screen here who have also done wonderful work. But the three of you have provided extraordinary leadership, and we're going to do what we can to see how we can do our share as well. But thank you so much to the three of you. Thanks to everyone who's joined us. Look forward to seeing many of you on February 4th when we figure out our next steps.
Thank you.
All.
Thank you all.
Thanks for having us. Thanks for
Thanks
doing
so
this.
much.